Lyn works in the areas of ethics, social political philosophy, and feminist philosophy, with a special interest in sexual ethics. She completed her PhD at Vanderbilt University in 2019 and now serves as a lecturer and associate director of undergraduate studies at Vanderbilt. She's currently working on a series of papers about monogamy and one day would like to write a book on how monogamy functions as a tool of the patriarchy. So thank you, Lyn. Come on up.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to start off by just thanking our conference organizers for pulling this together. You should all keep doing that a lot because it is a privilege to be able to come and talk about things that are so interesting to us. So this paper that I'm about to talk about is actually part of a bigger project. It's still kind of in its early stages, so I'm really looking forward to just digesting some of these questions with you all and getting your really constructive feedback. But without further ado, I'll go ahead and get into it. So my talk starts with just attention that's been identified in literature and has been taken up by many folks, including Natasha McKeever. So this tension rests in this idea that sexuality or access to sex is generally considered to have a lot of value for us, right? It offers us access to all kinds of experiences outside of our relationship and is valuable in lots of ways. But monogamy actually introduces this idea of a restriction of that access to value, right? So we say to our partner, you can no longer have these kinds of experiences or pursue these avenues of growth or what have you. So you're restricting access to value. And so more philosophers think this has got to be defended, right? You've got to give some good reasons why, in fact, you would apply the restriction of sexual exclusivity. And so a lot of, there's been some ink spilled over this attempt to kind of understand and tease out how we can apply this restriction and how we could defend it. And so one way that we have seen that's been taken up in the literature is to take what you might call like a value-added approach. So it seems like monogamy or sexual exclusivity restricts our access to things of value, but we could say that that same restriction adds value, right, for certain kinds of couples. And I'll go ahead and star this here and say I am going to focus on couples here. I don't mean to be exclusionary, but it just seems simplest analytically for now. We can definitely talk about in the Q&A if people have other thoughts. I don't want to shut the door on that. In any case, we think specifically about why we might take this kind of approach. And the thought here might be something like some things that have been expressed by Natasha McKeever in the literature. So this is the idea that sexual exclusivity offers one way of sort of making a relationship special by having this very exclusive activity, sex, that some people see as being an exclusive activity that adds value. We take that activity, we apply it just to us and our relationship, and we're able to mark out this relationship as distinct and special, right? And there's a lot of comfort in that for some folks. And we have another kind of justification from Fiona Wooler and Brian Reaver, and this is the idea that sexual exclusivity can kind of provide value by indicating that a relationship is meaningful or significant enough to introduce sacrifices, right? And this is why people find it to be a valuable practice, because they say it allows them to feel like they're chosen, like they're enough, right? And it's done in part through the exercise of exclusivity, because this is what signals that the relationship is important and worth protecting and all these other things. And so on these kinds of strategies, these are often taken to be reasons why we can think that monogamy might be justified, that it may in fact be a morally okay or defensible practice. But we're getting now, I think, into the territory that's really going to occupy me in the talk, and it starts with the question about whether or not we can think about cases where partners don't actually agree on the value of sexual exclusivity. So one thing I want to highlight about these kinds of approaches is that a lot of times, or by definition almost, they assume that the couple in question agrees on whether or not they should be monogamous and also the value of that practice, right? And so in those conditions, it then really makes sense to say it's a valuable practice, it's defensible, and all these other things. But I want to suggest that that's going to be kind of limited as a defense, right? Because the idea here is that it's happening in contexts where everyone's on board. And what we see actually is that more and more often couples are actually not agreeing on whether or not they want to be monogamous, and what kinds of values they want to see reflected in their relationships. And so non-monogamy is increasingly becoming a desirable option for many people. And I have here just a quote from a poll, and so, polls are what they are, but I think it's useful to kind of express a sentiment that's more and more often being seen, and it's this idea that people want to try monogamy or be non-monogamous. So in the poll, 43% of millennials say that their ideal relationship is non-monogamous, and 23% of all respondents said that the relationship was already non-monogamous. And so it seems like we're seeing this trend, and we have to be able to have something to say about what to make sense of these respective sexual practices. And I want to also add that it's precisely in cases where couples don't actually agree about the value of sexual exclusivity, whether or not that is worth a restriction on the value of sexual freedom, that the question of its moral justification becomes the most pressing, right? Because now couples have to negotiate and decide what they're going to do, because they don't actually think that being chosen, being enough, or all these other things, these other values are going to be enough for them and how they want to design their relationship. And these are actually not the kinds of concerns that are addressed by these defenders of monogamy. Nevertheless, I am actually going to reference back to these folks because I do think they have an insight that can help us later in the talk. So I'm not trying to say that these views are somehow not tenable. I think they just have a very certain kind of thing to offer us. Okay, so now I want to just pose a couple key questions in the project. First, as I've already been kind of talking about, we might wonder whether or not romantic love is consistent with with monogamy. That's a major typo. So it really changes the meaning of the sentence. I think it's not always clear that it is consistent with monogamy. Rather, it can be, at least in these certain kinds of situations that we've seen discussed in the literature. But importantly, the second question comes out of the reality that many people face in relationships, and that's this question of, like, is there a normative framework that can sort of adequately address the moral reasons for or against the practice of monogamy or non-monogamy? Can we get something that will help us help people inform their decisions, right, about what they ought to do in their relationships? And can ethics and moral philosophy help us do that? And so that's kind of the main aim, I would say, in my paper. And I also draw on this question of whether or not romantic love is consistent with monogamy to give us some tools to think about that question. So if we wanted to think about a normative framework for understanding what we ought to do if we're faced in a situation where we have to decide between these respective practices, is to just appeal to the deontic realm. To say, if we can look at concepts like obligation to try to carve out, what we owe our partner in these kinds of situations, maybe that would be useful. So one question that's been taken up in the literature by Chalmers and York is this question of, is monogamy morally permissible? And they fight about that a good bit. And my understanding is actually also still engaged about this outside of the literature. But they sort of have this debate. And in many ways, thinking about the deontic here is kind of the guiding light in the literature, where even people who are defending monogamy feel like they have to respond to it. They're like, okay, is it morally permissible? Is it morally justifiable? Were you violating some obligation, maybe to respect others' autonomy or what have you? And I think that is a useful set of tools to use. So I don't want to say we shouldn't do it, or these frameworks are altogether not useful, but I do want to maybe point to just a few things that I think the deontic approach, as I'll call it, a few things that I think that it faces. And I'm not trying to start fights in the room in the Q&A, so if you are inclined to think these things, please do press me a little. This is just me kind of getting my feet wet here. So the idea that we might say, okay, we actually have a duty to be non-monogamous, that monogamy is not in fact morally permissible, even if we have some right to do it or wrong to do it. This is roughly Harry Chalmers' view. That idea, I think, runs into a few problems. First, I think that when we talk about these respective practices in this way, we might force an objectionable trade-off on the moral agent. So first, the moral agent could do the right thing and say, I'm gonna white-knuckle non-monogamy because I feel like that's required of me, and like it's owed to my partner, and et cetera, et cetera. but they may, for a variety of reasons, suffer in that relationship. And it's interesting and not a coincidence, I'm sure, that my talk is coming off the heels of the last talk by Ida about this question about attachment theory, because I think that many people do have a really hard time with non-monogamy for reasons that are traceable to their experiences, their traumas, their histories, and we can use attachment theory to understand this, but other kinds of things. And so it seems like non-monogamy is not necessarily a super attainable practice for everyone. But they're faced with that option, or they can kind of keep their relationship on their own terms, insist on a monogamy, and thereby just do the wrong thing. Right? So I think that there's a way in which perhaps this points to a bigger issue with taking the deontic perspective on the most intimate realm of our lives, that it's sort of placing this responsibility on agents in a way that's perhaps untenable in practice, and introduces certain kinds of burdens that we might think are heavy, if not insurmountable, and it's important to kind of note that. But secondly, we also have another thing to kind of think about here in the same vein, and it's this idea of not only are we thinking about what people can and can't do, maybe because of their conditions or other kinds of constraints, we can also think about like what people want and what they find valuable in a more positive sense. And as we were seeing at the beginning of the talk, some people do in fact find monogamy to be valuable for clearly stated reasons, or they may find that that particular relationship style or arrangement allows them to express certain commitments or access certain values that they have. And if we press on them and we say, actually, no, what you want is not consistent with what morality requires of you, you need to abandon these things, then it looks like maybe we're pressing on the integrity of the agent, right? To be able to live a life on their own terms and access values that they care about. And I'm thinking here of like Bernard Williams, of course, but I think there are some ways in which the idea of a good life is something that we ought to design, right, in the most intimate realm with like someone that we love. It seems like morality is going to have to play a role, but also it might be in tension with other things we want to think meaningfully about. And so I will actually introduce a different normative framework or approach that I think can get us some of the goods of championing non-monogamy without maybe falling into these kinds of conversations. So the framework that I actually want to propose revisits the beginning of the talk, and this question of whether or not the practice of monogamy is consistent with romantic love. And so I actually want to diverge from the view at the beginning. I think that monogamy is not always consistent with romantic love, and I think that highlighting the way that it's not can give us decisive moral reasons in favor of non-monogamy. So the kind of methodology that I propose we use here is to look at the fit between the normative commitments of romantic love and the requirement of sexual exclusivity. I say fit here, but we could also say misfit. There's a way in which I don't think that at the level of practice, monogamy best expresses some of our commitments as lovers. And I'll sort of assess those in a moment. But I first want to call attention to certain kinds of descriptive markers or features of love that are commonly recognized in both psychological and the philosophical literature. And so this is the desire for our beloved's well-being, for their own sake, a desire to form a shared identity or union, and the desire for reciprocity. And so I want to propose that if we look at these features, we're not just getting a descriptive account of what love is. So psychologists can look at a situation and be like, okay, yep, that's love, right? I'm trying to say that, in fact, these are deep and meaningful normative commitments. So we design our lives and we make decisions in regard to our partner when we act from these kinds of concerns or desires and values, right? So they're important to us. They inform our decisions. They're part of our motivational set in ways that will inform how we live our lives, right? So they're things that do guide us, and they're not just features that happen to exist. And I think that they're weighty things that we care about, and that it's useful to see if these things are in fact represented in our practice. So I'm going to address just 1 and 3 actually, and for the sake of time, But 2 obviously is really important, and we actually saw in the last talk a little bit of a treatment of that, so we can definitely visit number 2 in the Q&A if you want. So first, I'll look at welfare and then reciprocity, and so first we'll get an understanding of what welfare is. So here I have a quote from Frankfurt. It basically says, love consists most basically in a disinterested concern for the well-being or flourishing of the person who is loved. And so I think a lot of us have a really intuitive understanding of this, that when we love another person, we want the best for them, and we want it for their own sake and not because there's something in it for us. So for non-instrumental reasons, we want them to succeed at life, we want them to be happy, we want them to flourish, whether or not we get anything out of that. And we also are at times even inclined to sacrifice for the person that we love. So there are things we do for our partners that we would not necessarily do for other people or just anyone, right? We set aside our interests in order to advance theirs. We make decisions with their well-being in mind, and we might be suspicious, for instance, if somebody says they love another person but is like never inclined to sacrifice anything for them, right? Maybe that person might have a weird quirk of their personality or be self-centered or something, but I really do think that this idea of self-sacrifice is something that at least some of the time, even though it's not necessarily required, is something that we're going to see. And we also have to balance as well our interests with others, so I'm not trying to say that self-sacrifice or self-sacrifice is kind of always going to be the case. There's a complicated balance here, but even in cases where we do default to our own kinds of interests or concerns as a situation, we still wish that we could do something differently for them, and we still wish that, you know, their well-being would be advanced, even if it can't always be delivered, because every relationship is a negotiation. Okay, so the other feature of romantic love that's important for my account is reciprocity. So when we love another person, we often want them to love us back, right? So this seems kind of obvious, and it's an important part of what love is, but we can also see that it's going to vary with relationship type or context. So for instance, in the familial forms of love, specifically a parent for a child, we may find that reciprocity is not always going to be as essential or prized as it is in other kinds of relationships. So people, I mean, I'm not a parent, maybe one day, God willing, I'll be a parent, I'm not really sure. But from what I understand, a lot of parents, even if they're separated from their children or estranged, or their children can't love them back, right, their love still endures. It doesn't have the same kind of requirement for reciprocity that's as rich as we might find in other kinds of more contingent relationships like friends or lovers, right? And in romantic love specifically, I think we see perhaps the greatest desire for the other person to love us back. Like we desire mutuality of some kind. And I have here a quote from Foster: "We may not love someone simply because we want our love reciprocated, but reciprocation at some point, or the hope of such, is a necessary part of the development of romantic love. The man who loves a woman who, in return, does not acknowledge his existence can fairly be said to possess an illusory love." And so I think here the desire for reciprocation is really important. Maybe that love is actually not reciprocated. So I don't really know if we think about the implications of that distinction, but I think the desire for reciprocation is still really, really important, and we might wonder if somebody loves another if they don't have this feature. Okay, so reciprocity is really important in the current context for my talk because it's going to play a role in the demonstration of one's, well, let me back up. So in monogamy specifically, and this I think goes back to Ida's talk as well, there's this desire for security in a relationship, right? So this is one thing that my students often express to me when I'm teaching on this stuff, that what monogamy is supposed to give us is this kind of security. And the way that it does that is in part because it reveals or provides evidence of reciprocity, that the other person loves us as we love them. And they don't even just love us, but they're willing to forego other partners for us, right, to demonstrate to us that we are loved by them. And this is what is valuable to them, feeling chosen, feeling enough. And I think a feeling of security comes from this kind of demonstration of one's reciprocity through a willingness to take on the sort of commitment or the requirement of sexual exclusivity. And so this is how we see it manifest in people's logic when they say they desire monogamy. And I think it has to do with this idea of security and reciprocity. So putting these two commitments side by side, we can kind of see how they stack up. If we return to the question of like how to assess these different practices, monogamy and non-monogamy. And so one way that we can proceed is to look first at welfare, these kinds of commitments that we have, where we desire the well-being of another. And so I would argue that if this is one of our anchoring kind of commitments, then in situations where both members really desire monogamy and they would both thrive under its practice, then it seems like that would be a reason to favor that practice, right? If they're trying to make that decision. It would not necessarily be off the table. Whereas if we employ some kind of deontic account, we might perhaps say there's still something problematic about this kind of arrangement of a relationship. But in cases where the desires of the couple actually diverge, the normative commitment of welfare is not really going to provide a lot of guidance. It's not going to be clearly in favor of either practice, because if person A wants monogamy and person B wants non-monogamy, then person A is going to want non-monogamy for person B is going to want monogamy for person A. They're both attuned to the other's welfare, right? There's not necessarily going to be some way of kind of making sense of how to proceed and what kind of arrangement we might desire or what reasons exist. But I do want to say that at least what's revealed by attending to welfare is this idea that there is at least a significant or weighty reason to consider non-monogamy. So in a culture where monogamy is the default option, where many couples are entering a deliberative scenario, probably already having been monogamous, but not necessarily, there's now going to be a reason for someone to say, you know what, maybe non-monogamy is in fact the thing that I ought to try, insofar as I value my partner's flourishing. Right? And that's access to a reason that maybe hasn't been clearly articulated and that would be irrelevant in the situation that many, or the context that many couples do face. So I think welfare is still an important feature of love to highlight here, an important normative commitment to think about. Okay, so reciprocity, on the other hand, I think is a little bit less easy to reconcile with the requirement of sexual exclusivity. And this is the part in my talk where things get a little dicey, and I really do welcome feedback from the room, because I'm very much still trying to think through this. It's kind of an intuition at this point that I'm trying to give a little bit of analytical scaffolding to, which is maybe bad practice, but I do want to hear folks' thoughts. All right, so the first kind of thought, if we're looking at this kind of desire for mutuality or reciprocity, is to think about what kind of relationship style would deliver that for us. And I want to argue that conditions of freedom and a relative lack of sexual restriction might offer a more robust foundation for richer reciprocity. So I have here, can we be meaningfully chosen by our partners if their options are tightly constrained? So we can imagine a case where maybe people make a monogamous commitment, they're married for 30 years, they still say that they feel chosen by their partner and enough for their partner that's very valuable to them. And we can just question whether or not that is a mutual or a very rich demonstration of mutual love, as opposed to a situation where they had other kinds of relationships, other kinds of loves in their lives, but still chose to stay in line with that partner in some regard, right? Whether that is living with them or some other kind of anchoring relationship with them. So it seems like it's not necessarily super meaningful to be chosen if in fact someone has no options and hasn't had that for decades, right? And I think this kind of feeds into these latter points that I want to make. And it sort of gets into, sorry, I'm switching slides. This is the same content as the last slide, but bigger, so that the folks in the room can read it. I know the tiny print is probably not great. I think this kind of gets into the second point, which is this idea that many people desire monogamy as a sort of illustration of reciprocity and as proof of their beloved's love for them. This is what I was talking about earlier. And I think this actually feeds a lot into Ida's talk as well, which thinks about the sort of desire for security or secure attachment. And I think that to feel secure, a lot of monogamous people often want the other person to desire only them. So whether that is in casual context, this is not all monogamous people, like hashtag not all monogamous people. We gotta, respect them still. So in casual contexts where maybe they don't want their partner to even experience a passing attraction to others, or they might want something deeper, and certainly want something deeper, like being the one person that those people love, that their partner loves exclusively. This is like a reciprocation of exclusive love. And that is going to be the thing that provides the anchor for them to feel secure. But I'm not so sure that monogamy can sort of provide that security or serve as that kind of evidence. Because I think in order to provide fitting and appropriate proof of some kind of like authentically, exclusively shared love, one's partner must not desire other intimate connections. And if they're only being willing to be monogamous because you're demanding it or they're doing it to appease you, then that's not necessarily going to be proof of some kind of robust reciprocity, right? Because they're not allowed other options to begin with, so they can't, the reciprocity that you're getting is artificial. Or if they do accede to it and say, okay, we will be monogamous for you, similarly, it's not going to be something that's gonna give people the sort of gift that they want of this exclusively shared love, right? And so I think that it's kind of misguided to demand monogamy in some cases, and that in fact it might be at odds with reciprocity or the desire for reciprocity from one's partner. This kind of trades on the idea that if you have to ask for reciprocal feelings of an exclusive kind of love expressed in the practice of monogamy, then it probably can't be meaningfully given, right? And I think there's some kind of tension here that's very interesting that I'm still kind of trying to work out, and my suspicion is there are lots of logical sort of problems with how people think about monogamy as a solution to these desires for security. And yeah, I would really appreciate thoughts on this aspect of the talk for sure. So I have here a quote that I think really, I actually just uncovered it the other day, that I think really captures some of the intuition happening here, or at least one aspect of it. And it's from Ellen Willis Aronowitz, who is a feminist activist. Her daughter wrote a book called Bad Sex that I'm kind of working my way through. What she writes, this is from her diary, I should say. Paradox, compulsive monogamy is joyless. Monogamy that one asks for, demands, intimidates the other person into. Monogamy inspired by duty, moralism, guilt, habit, lack of imagination, timidity. A desire for peace at any point or fear the other person will do it if you do isn't worth having. But spontaneous, voluntary monogamy based on an intensely focused passion, such that sleeping with anyone else seems superfluous, as unneeded and an unwanted distraction is entirely different. So I think this kind of really captures in many ways the idea that a lot of people really do desire that their partner only want them, but then they think that somehow getting this restriction and bringing it into play will kind of get them that, but it seems like it's not going to, right? It's an artificial kind of expression. It's not real evidence of anything, perhaps. Or maybe it is evidence for something, but maybe not the kind of evidence we would want for full reciprocity. So in conclusion, I kind of want to basically argue that the practice of monogamy is not always consistent with normative commitments as lovers. Maybe in some cases it is consistent with some of these commitments, but it certainly isn't always. And I think that in many cases that are currently unrecognized, non-monogamy is going to be the morally better option. And I think that hopefully my framework can do a little bit of work to help people uncover when that in fact might be something that they should consider. And I think I do have like a little bit of time still, like 5 minutes or so. Yeah. So I'll just leave the final thought which, again, I don't know, I feel like I'm poking the bear on this, but I really can't help myself. And I just want to sort of highlight maybe a few advantages of this approach over other approaches that champion non-monogamy, like the deontic critiques of monogamy. And this is the idea that perhaps what we get with my framework is this idea that we can appeal to sort of ideals or commitments that people have as lovers, that they already see working in their lives and appreciate the value of, to kind of convince them to try non-monogamy, rather than saying because of these external imposed demands of morality, you have to try non-monogamy, right? So it seems like that's a different kind of rationale or logic or justification available that I think may allow people to take on board the commitments of non-monogamy in ways that preserve their integrity as agents and do less damage to that. But the approach also recognizes that non-monogamy may in fact not be the best option for everyone. And I think that's an important thing to highlight as well, that there may be nuance here to appreciate why someone may in fact prefer monogamy but have strong reasons to try non-monogamy. And I think that ultimately this kind of framework, if I could articulate it well, would give people maybe a less alienating rationale for the practice of non-monogamy than maybe the sort of strategy of revealing why it might be wrong to be monogamous. So yeah, that's my talk.